Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Have you ever thought about whether the Dursleys were truly evil, or if the movies simply made them look that way? What if the truth about them was much more complicated, and they weren't the heartless monsters we've been led to believe? In today's video, you will find out what the films didn't show us about the Dursleys, and why their story might deserve a second look. Throughout the Harry Potter series, few characters were as despised as the Dursleys. The ordinary Muggle family that raised Harry was portrayed as cruel, petty, and even abusive. Thanks to the movies, they stood alongside villains like Dolores Umbridge and Draco Malfoy, despite committing far fewer actual crimes. I won't say they were perfect, but maybe they weren't as bad as we thought. It's time to set the record straight and uncover their real story, the one that was mostly left out of the films. So grab your favourite Muggle tea and let's dive in. The Dursleys before Harry Potter. Petunia Dursley was the older sister of Lily Potter, Harry's mother. As children, they were close, but everything changed when Lily was revealed to be a witch and accepted into Hogwarts. Petunia dreamed of joining her sister in the magical world, even writing to Dumbledore, begging for a chance to study magic. But she was a Muggle, and her wish was impossible. Over time, jealousy turned into resentment. She distanced herself from magic, left her childhood home, and married a man who shared her views. Vernon Dursley was an average Muggle, practical, ambitious, and deeply concerned with order and normalcy. He didn't just dislike magic, he feared and distrusted it. But he and Petunia still had to maintain some contact with Harry's parents. After all, they were family. At one fateful dinner, James Potter mocked Vernon for his mundane lifestyle, embarrassing him deeply. From that moment on, Vernon held a grudge, and unfortunately, he directed much of that resentment at Harry, who reminded him too much of his father. Their son, Dudley Dursley, grew up spoiled and entitled. Given everything he wanted and never disciplined, he became a bully. But as we'll see later, even Dudley wasn't beyond redemption. Why the Dursleys disliked Harry? Their mistreatment of Harry wasn't random. It had reasons, even if they weren't good ones. Petunia resented Harry because he represented everything she had once wished for, but could never have. He was a wizard, just like her sister. He was kind, intelligent, and strong, qualities that made her own son look worse in comparison. And perhaps, deep down, she feared that his presence would bring danger to their home. Vernon disliked Harry because he was the spitting image of James Potter, the man who had humiliated him years ago. That bitterness never faded. And as for Dudley, he bullied Harry simply because he had never been taught otherwise. He was a child raised without boundaries, and hurting others made him feel powerful. Were the Dursleys truly evil? Despite everything, I wouldn't say they were outright villains. Here's why. The Dursleys tried to keep Harry away from the dangers of the magical world. When they desperately blocked his Hogwarts letters, maybe they weren't just being cruel. Maybe they genuinely thought they were protecting him from a world filled with dark wizards, Voldemort, and deadly spells. Over time, they showed moments of remorse. Petunia stopped Vernon from throwing Harry out after the Dementor attack. And in their final goodbye, she hesitated, as if she wanted to say something meaningful, but couldn't find the words. Even Dudley changed. He thanked Harry for saving him from the Dementors, and later, as an adult, kept in touch with him and Ginny. The Dursleys may have been harsh, but looking at their story from a different angle, it's possible to see moments that suggest they weren't entirely without heart. Take Petunia, for example. She spent years pretending that magic didn't exist, calling wizards freaks and treating Harry like a burden. But behind all of that was something more complex: fear, jealousy, and maybe even a tiny trace of regret. She knew what had happened to Lily and James. She knew that keeping Harry meant putting her own family at risk. And yet, despite all her bitterness, she still let him stay. She could have handed him over to an orphanage or thrown him out onto the streets, but she didn't. Then there was the moment before the Dursleys left Privet Drive for good. Petunia stood by the door, hesitating. For the first time, she looked at Harry not as an unwanted obligation, but as a boy who had lost everything. She opened her mouth as if to say something, maybe an apology, maybe a final warning, but then, as always, she swallowed her emotions and walked away. It wasn't much, but it was something. And Vernon? He was rude, cruel, and impatient, but his actions were often driven by fear rather than pure malice. Magic terrified him. The idea that something so uncontrollable could exist in his carefully structured world shook him to his core. He worked hard to build a life of normalcy, and Harry was a constant reminder that no amount of effort could shield his family from the unknown. So he overcompensated. He tried to suppress magic, to pretend it didn't exist, to make Harry as ordinary as possible. He believed that if he could stamp out every trace of wizardry, he could keep his family safe. Of course he was wrong, but in his own twisted way, he thought he was doing what was necessary. Even Dudley, the spoiled golden child, had his own journey of growth. As a child, he was cruel to Harry, not because of any deep hatred, but simply because he had been raised to see himself as superior. He had never been denied anything. He had never been told no. He had never faced the idea that someone else could be more important than him. So he lashed out. He mocked Harry, he bullied him, he took pleasure in seeing him suffer. But then came the Dementors. The moment Dudley felt real fear, real helplessness, something changed in him. For the first time in his life, he understood what it was like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of something bigger than himself. And after that, he was never quite the same. He still wasn't perfect. He was still loud, still selfish, still a little slow to understand things, but he wasn't cruel anymore. His last words to Harry before leaving Privet Drive were simple but meaningful. "I don't think you're a waste of space." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but for someone like Dudley, who had spent his entire life looking down on Harry, it was as close to an admission of guilt as he could manage. And in the years that followed, he even made an effort to stay in touch, to check in. But the real question is this: if the Dursleys weren't truly evil, then why did they treat Harry the way they did? The answer lies in fear, resentment, and above all, misunderstanding. Petunia resented Lily for being special, for being chosen, for having the life Petunia secretly wished for. That resentment transferred to Harry, the living reminder of everything she had been denied. Vernon feared magic, feared losing control over his own life, and tried to bury that fear by controlling Harry instead. Dudley was a product of his environment. He simply followed the example set by his parents, treating Harry as something lesser because that was what he had been taught. But even in their worst moments, they weren't as monstrous as some of the true villains of the wizarding world. They never physically harmed Harry, never starved him to death, never crossed the line into true brutality. They were neglectful, they were unfair, they were selfish, but they weren't beyond redemption. And in the end, they changed. Petunia didn't say the words she wanted to say, but she hesitated. Vernon, for all his grumbling, didn't fight against leaving Harry behind. Dudley, once a bully, left as something closer to a friend. It makes you wonder, if things had been just a little different, if they had been given the chance to see magic in a different light, would they have treated Harry better? Could they have accepted him? Could they have been a family in the true sense of the word? Maybe, maybe not. But what is clear is that their story isn't as simple as good versus evil. They were flawed. They were human. And in the end, that might make them one of the most complex families in the entire Harry Potter series.